we invited all animal advocates from around the world to explore important and complex topics. Through respectful solution-based dialogue, we attempt to find common ground. Welcome to another episode of Common Ground. I'm super excited to share this episode with you. It's one of our most robust conversations yet, and it actually went a bit long, so it's going to be split into 3 parts. So be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram and hit that subscribe button so you can see the other episodes. With that, let's start the show. As animal advocates, we want to advance the plight of our fellow animals as fast as possible. But what about the overall strategy, and how do our tactics fit into this? What campaign should we be dedicating our limited time to? Should activists be encouraged to live vegan?
Yeah, we did a previous show, didn't we, Jeremy? Where we had Bernie Wright from a Dublin-based group called Alliance for Animal Rights, and she was organising the Shelburne Park greyhound campaign, and she said, or there was a bit of pushback when they tried to do like a vegan picnic, and ironically, it seemed to be the vegetarians who were pushing back more than anybody else. But she does report that quite a lot of the people, or some of the people, have kind of expressed interest in veganism now. So again, it feeds into that kind of
That's
debate.
interesting to say that about a greyhound group, though. Sorry, just to say, but with this particular group, they were quite pushed back by people that were known as sort of like hunt saboteurs or vegan, because we would talk a bit like there was quite a few vegans in the group, but ultimately a lot of the people that were vegan activists or animal rights activists but who were vegan, a lot of them got pushed out of the group because they were made not to feel comfortable, because a lot of people there weren't, so like the leader of the group wasn't vegan, she was vegetarian, but she ended up, it's interesting though with those sort of single issue campaigns, is because there's a lot of non-vegans there, and it goes to show that there are people that care about animals, but then when you start talking about veganism, or as in having a plant-based diet, they can really get funny about it. It's quite bizarre.
How common is it for greyhounds to be forced to race?
So, I mean, Ronnie, you did greyhound campaigning for many years. So what was the story with your experience?
With regard to greyhound racing, I was involved within for 13 years. My wife Louise and I, we set up the first group in the UK to campaign against greyhound racing, which was called Greyhound Action. And it was mainly to do with holding protests outside tracks to educate people not to support greyhound racing, because most people going to greyhound racing weren't particularly, I wouldn't say they're cruel people, they were just people going for a night out. So it was a way of like removing economic support from an industry that was, to be quite honest, was already struggling. So it taking away a section of their support meant that quite a few of these tracks actually went under.
There's not many left now, is there, Ronnie?
No, I think there's been 3 closed in the last month, including Bellevue, which is a track in Manchester, which was probably the most popular track in the country. And it's at one time there were about 120 greyhound tracks operating in the country, and now there's probably only about 20 now, I'd say. It's really been reduced, and that was a kind of effective campaign in terms of identifying what was it that was keeping the industry alive, and actually putting pressure on that point. Actually
what about this specific point about people joining who are not vegan, vegan, or people who were running it not being vegan and that ostracized the vegans? Did you have any of that?
No, we never had any of that, to be honest. I mean, we were vegan that ran the campaign. There were people involved in the campaign that weren't vegan, but there was no problem about any, because there were kind of local, obviously sort of local groups and local campaigns where people protested against their local tracks. And to be quite honest, a large number of those people were vegan anyway. So there was never that problem. I mean, I had the kind of sort of reverse experience myself many years before when I was involved in the Hunt Saboteurs. We had a Hunt Saboteurs group in North London, and the kind of 3 people that ran the group were vegan, including myself. And we had a lot of people join in, and almost always the people that joined weren't vegan and weren't vegetarian. And when they heard we were vegan, they'd say, "Oh, we're not interested in that. We enjoy eating our meat, and we're just here because we want to save the fox." That was their attitude. They were, most people were kind of quite resistant when they heard we were vegan. But most of those people, within just a few weeks, actually went vegan from just rubbing shoulders with us, and because we were able to explain to them the reasons for veganism and kind of help them become vegan. Almost everyone that joined our group.
I think there's a lot of evidence, it seems, from all over the world, even that this process, that becoming activist first and then becoming vegan. I mean, Wendy, I think Mel Broughton would say that seems to be a process that works. The real issue for vegan education people is whether you've got to, as it were, downplay the vegan stuff at first in order to, I was always kind of thinking, okay, well, even if you wanted to go with that model, how would you practically do it? I mean, I would have to change the name of the Vegan Information Project, presumably, because that's gonna put people off originally, who might subsequently become vegan, but not at first. So, there's a kind of it's almost, you get involved with tactics or politics, whereas I always believe in being honest myself. But
why is it that greyhound racing is less popular than horse racing? Is it some sort of cultural speciesism that exploiting dogs for racing is somehow worse than horses? Or I'm just curious on that.
And perhaps classism factors in there too. Just because horse racing tends to be associated with kind of higher.
Is it not just because it's a smaller industry, full stop, or something like that?
It used to be more popular than horse racing at one time. It's been greyhound racing was very hard hit when in the UK anyway, when the betting laws were reformed. I think it was in the 60s, and people were allowed to go into betting shops on High Street, because prior to that, the only place they could bet was at the track. So people that wanted to gamble would have to go to greyhound racing. And greyhound racing was very popular because it took place a lot more frequently than horse racing. I mean, horse racing only takes place at each of the horse racing courses. It kind of only takes place, every couple of weeks or something like that, perhaps, or less than that. Whereas greyhound racing can take place 3 or 4 times a week at a dog track. And so it was a very frequent way that people, and this was kind of mostly men. People didn't go as families; it just men would go and stand in the cold and drink and smoke and gamble at these dog tracks. And it was very popular, and it was dealt a big blow when people were just allowed to go into a betting shop and place a bet. And that was kind of when the dog racing industry went into decline. And I think there's less money. I mean, it does rely, it was poorer people that went to the dog racing, and I think that's probably why. And it's a kind of different. The structure of it's different. It's more easy. It's easier to actually, I think, educate people not to support dog racing, because they kind of go to dog racing just for a night out, whereas with horse racing, people treat it kind of more as a kind of a bigger event, I think. And that's why, and there is more money in it. It is, the people involved in it are more wealthy, and so it's been able to survive better than dog racing.
It's easier to protest outside a greyhound track than a horse racing track, because there are far more people attending horse race meetings, so protesters would be more likely to be attacked at the horse racing gatherings.
I'd love to know, of the people attending either species being forced to race, how many people actually know that they're killed as a result, When it comes to greyhounds, it's what, 10,000 in the UK, I believe, that, quote unquote, vanish each year throughout the whole process of the recruiting, if as it were. So
the problem is, the main problem, and this is with horse racing as well as greyhound racing, is the greyhounds and horses that are killed before they even race, because about half of the number that are bred aren't suitable, and that's where the biggest death toll comes. People don't realise that, because there's a lot of talk about, especially with greyhounds, about greyhounds being rehomed after they come off the track. But the ones that actually get to race, in a sense, are the lucky ones, because they've survived the culling process of the young dogs. Exactly the same with horse racing. With horse racing, it's about 10,000. I think with greyhound racing, it may be less now, because the industry is so much smaller. So there is much less demand now for greyhounds to be bred, and so fewer end up being killed.
yeah, and to Brad's point, I think just from a general outreach perspective, I found, it is a bit speciesist in and of itself, but almost tapping into, like, almost starting with horses and dogs and seeing what people's thoughts are around using them, and then building on to other species, I found is quite a good tactic. So especially here in Brighton, we have both in a short distance of us from where I do outreach. So it's quite like, a few miles away from here. Here's what happens. How do you feel about that?
Yeah,
so.
Because at one time in the animal rights movement, when we started Greyhound Action, which was in about 97, a lot of people in the animal rights movement said, well, why are you campaigning against that? That's just dogs running around the track and they enjoy it. And so why is it an issue? And we had to explain to people in the animal rights movement about what happened to the dogs, because there wasn't an awareness. There was no movement. In fact, the movement in the USA against greyhound racing started before the one in the UK, which is quite unusual, because most of the kind of animal rights stuff kind of seems to start in the UK first, but with greyhound racing it wasn't. The campaigns in the USA, and there's been a lot of success in the USA with closing tracks.
Did you say 1997, Ronnie?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
You're just lying, aren't you? Because we know the movement didn't exist until 2018.
Oh yes, that's right. Of course, yeah. I was lying.
Yeah.
I was lying. Yeah, and there was no animal liberation front or anything. That was all made up.
Do individuals in the grassroots movement need more empowerment?
The one way of empowering them would be to sort out the finances of the movement, and that would inevitably, for me at least, mean taking away the wealth or the power of the national group, or at least affecting the national group system in some way. Because at the moment, we've got so many people who are waged at the moment, and then now we've got the entrepreneurs, that a lot of vegan money is being tied up into kind of power centers, and so it can't get out to the grassroots. And we've never really been able to figure out a way of distributing it. And it'd be really good if we could,
I agree it would be great to have a different funding structure, but I guess the question back to you, Roger, how do you redistribute things from the national groups, the entrepreneurs as you put them, and so forth?
Well, I think there's substantial problems here, Jeremy, because there's all kinds of things. There's sociological problems, but there's psychological problems, in the sense that people almost like assume that because there's a national group, that they're kind of staffed by experts, and so there's this issue about, well, where do I give my money? And then if you think to things like, if you're going to get money from things like legacies, and people like to leave a legacy, and so that means that they're going to look for stability. They're going to look for an organization which is going to last. Whereas if they think, well, what's the point of me giving £10,000 or whatever to something that I don't even know is going to be there in 3 years? So there's a kind of structural problem there. But in terms of donations, just actual donations, I've never understood why the grassroots and the rank and file of the movement seem to be more prepared to give money to already rich groups than to ones that are not rich. Because even my group and Declan's group, Vigo, what we do now is pretty good, we think, but it could certainly be improved if we had access to more money. And also, just keeping the vehicle on the road can be a struggle. And it's the same for a lot of the SAB groups. And so if they had that kind of weight taken off them, as well as then having a thing where we try to empower people, You know, I saw a recent video. I think it's only out about a couple of days with Pamela and Lynn Sawyer, and they were talking about how the current system is kind of disempowering. You know, it creates a passive membership. And, you know, Ronnie himself, you know, he says that if you're not vegan, go vegan. If you're vegan, become active. And if you're active, become an organizer. Now, we need to encourage that move from one to the other. You know, at the moment, the movement doesn't seem to be geared up to do that, I don't think.
So I work at an organization called Animal Charity Evaluators. And every year we have these charity recommendations where we recommend kind of the national groups that you were just talking about, that I think that have like already a lot of resources, and we basically don't encourage people to donate to those because they have like a lot of room for more funding. And a concern about that is that the smaller groups don't have any potential to get funding as well. So it would be like, we're recommending donations to these larger organizations already to make them grow, but we really don't think that these small number of organizations are the only ones that we should be giving funding for. We really would like to give more funding to a wide variety of approaches and not just like the Humane League and the Good Food Institute and the ones that we typically recommend. So that is why we started the Defective Animal Advocacy Fund, which I'm running. But I would really like to see more approaches that are very much about like making bold asks and having like more of a liberationist approach and kind of things that are not covered yet by our recommended charities.
I mean, I'd like to see some type of fund. I mean, I actually contacted somebody to ask about what the situation was with Philip Woolen, and not that I was asking the guy for money because he gets enough of that. More to do with whether he had the kind of organizational structure or knowledge in order to kind of set up a kind of grassroots fund. See, it's not just money. I mean, I think Ronnie would say it's not just money. It's to do with other things as well. We need to kind of create a culture which is grassroots focused, it seems to me.
So that is kind of the distinction between the EA fund and the recommended charities, is that if we are recommending, like the impact of our charity recommendations could be like millions of dollars. And if we recommend a small organization with maybe, they may not have like the room to use all that funding, or there would be a lot of funding at one time to like use. So that's why we have the EAA fund to kind of bridge that gap.
I mean, would you need criteria, for example? Would the groups that you give to have staff members, for example? Or would you just have to, I mean, like, for example, you can probably see Declan Bowens on the screen there, and he's been doing a weekly event in Dublin City Centre for coming up to 6.5 years now, every single week. I think we missed about 4 weeks in 6 years. And so would it have to be a staffed group that you gave to, or could it just be anybody?
For the EA fund, we try to include everybody. There are some like considerations about like whether ACE can actually grant to them, because we are a 501c3, so we have certain tax regulations to be like compliant with. But we do aim to, like, just if it's a good project, we try to fund it, and also outside of the US, because a lot of resources are based in the US.
And that's a big question, because talking here, it almost sounds like we need an organization who can handle the big donations that almost distributes it to the grassroots. Because I agree, when you start sending to individual locales, it's going to be hard to manage where it's going to. But if you had a central body, I'm not putting my hand up to figure all this stuff out, by the way, but it sounds great in theory. You know?
Well, you haven't got anything else to do, Jeremy. But the point is, I mean, I agree with you, because that's always. I mean, obviously, you've got to have some kind of oversight system here, because a lot of people over the years have objected to this idea because they think, well, the money is going to be wasted. Now, on the one hand, that is a genuine problem that would have to be managed. On the other hand, they tend to forget that there's a lot of money now being wasted right now in the movement there's millions of pounds and dollars and euros being wasted. And I've always said that if you've got all the staff of all the groups, and there's more staff and more groups now than ever, and you lined them all up and they had their salaries and their job titles, I think we would be really shocked by it, about the amount of duplication that goes on. You know, because duplication is duplication on the grassroots level, that's okay, because you're dealing with your own community, but duplication on a national or international level doesn't make any sense. But the groups won't kind of collaborate because they want their logo on everything. So they've got to have their own range of T-shirts and their own range of posters, their own range of leaflets.
So just to speak to that point about organization and the idea of who decides who gets what funding, those kinds of things, I think this is probably one of our biggest problems right now, particularly, like you say, because a lot of the money is being funneled into these national groups and they won't play together. Like, they won't team up on a campaign. They won't support the grassroots movement. So it does make me wonder whether, as a grassroots community, we should kind of pressure campaign them and say, well, right, come on then. If we're all in it for the animals, let's all of us do this thing. And if you don't, well, then that speaks volumes.
So I think where the grassroots movement kind of needs financing is so that we've got more resources to set up more local groups. I think one of the problems with the grassroots movement and people campaigning locally in their communities is that there are so many areas where there aren't groups, and so there's no education towards the local public. There's no campaigning in those local areas, and in order to set those groups up and get them going, really needs a very hands-on approach. And so we could do with people who kind of work full-time doing that, and those people would need funding. They need to have some sort of wage, otherwise all their time. I mean, for instance, in our local vegan group, we got this great guy. He's a great campaigner, great activist, and he's having to work. He's having to work full time at a very tiring job to earn really quite a low wage to keep himself going. And it's it's such a waste of somebody that could actually do that job that I've spoken about. Be somebody that went and helped to set up groups, and I'm sure there's lots of other people like that. And I think that's probably the main area where kind of funding is needed, or at least a very important area where funding is needed. And it's a question of like working out how can we get more money into the grassroots. I think one of the ways would be to have a network of activist local groups that could kind of have money given to it as a network and then distribute that money. And that's something that Roger and I have been working on, getting in the very early stages of getting such a network set up on Facebook, so local groups can communicate with one another and share information, share resources, because I think people would probably be more willing to give money to that than to individual groups, and then the money could be shared out to groups that need it, or used to actually employ people to go around coordinating stuff and helping to set up new groups.
And yeah, I also wanted to clarify when you're talking about the grassroots that I agree with that, but I would also like to say that there's a lot of because I'm coming from Bosnia and I'm the president of the Vegan Society of Bosnia, and we have, for example, it's pretty similar in Croatia and other Balkanian countries. You don't have institutional support like you have in the European Union or maybe in states. So our organizations would mostly rely on the other fundings from the other organizations almost exclusively and just by the donations. As you know, we don't have that, how to say, institutional support or support from the government, for example. And then you have the movement that isn't really growing, isn't really following the global animal rights movement.
Yes, so the Effective Animal Advocacy Fund is basically for any type of promising projects that are being underfunded that we see as underfunded in the animal advocacy space. So that could include projects in countries where there is not a very well-funded animal advocacy movement, or approaches in the US or in Western Europe that are not receiving enough funding yet. Nothing is receiving enough funding, but that receive even less funding.
I agree 100% with Ronnie, what he was saying about, you know, we need hands-on approach to help people set up different groups in different areas. Like with me and Roger, you know, some weeks we'll have 4 people, maybe 6 people. Other weeks we could have maybe 15 people. But the big thing is to encourage these other people to, you know, we could have 15 people say, but we can run the table ourselves, you know, with 4 or 6 people, no problem. So these other people we'd have are on the fringes, kind of, they don't get a chance to talk to many people, to the public. So we try to encourage them to, you know, to set up tables themselves. But that's where the funding for groups like ours would come in, because we could buy tables and posters and TVs and, you know, get leaflets printed and all sorts of stuff like that to help them get going. But a big problem is, I think, too, that to incentivize these people, or to, you know, to get them started. You know, like Ronnie says, yeah, you would need people to stand with them to make them feel cool on the street, and you know, just to be there for a few weeks to you know, to answer some questions that people might put at them, that, you know, just to back them up, kind of thing. Ronnie is 100% on. I know Roger the same, but exactly stuff like that we need, you know. But and also I think in Ireland we have lots of vegan groups. You know, we've groups in Cork and Kerry and all sorts of places, and hundreds and thousands of people in these groups. But you know, myself and Roger and a few others went to different cities and towns, and we done outreach in these cities, but very few, no one has come forward to set up these outreach groups on a weekly basis or a monthly basis in any of these cities or towns. So I wonder what's wrong with people, that they don't, you know, have the gumption in them, sort of a thing, to go out and do this themselves. You know, and stand, you know, all you need is one other person to stand with you. When I set up Vigo at the start, I just put a post out in Dublin Vegans, and it was one person answered. It was an English woman that was going to college in Dublin, and she said she'd love to come along. So when I went along on the day, she was waiting for me when I appeared on the street. So that's how I started the Vigo group. So, you know, I wonder what's wrong with people that don't feel it in their power that they can do this. Like, it's so easy to do, like even without funding, you know, small amount of funding. All you need is the computer and a printer to, you know, you can make your own posters and you can print your own leaflets. So,
well, it's a bit of a personality thing, though, Declan. You know, like you know, you know your stuff. You were born on a dairy farm. You know it. You know, and as we know, when farmers come up and learn that you also have a farming background, they hate that, because they know now that you know what you're talking about. And so there would be that kind of confidence issue. There's kind of like personality issues and psychological issues, but there's also a more kind of fundamental thing, which I think when Lynn Sawyer comes, we're going to invite Pamela and Lynn to talk a little bit, because in their recent podcast, they talked about how we have a system that seems to disempower people and make them passive. And I'd like to explore that with them. But I think that's part of it, you know, so it's a complicated issue. It's not just a question of turning the tap on and kind of the funding is there. I mean, I know that you've given tables and posters to people and they've gone and you've never seen them again. You know, so it needs some kind of control, some foresight, some planning. It can't just be done very easily, I don't think, but it kind of still needs to be done. That's my view.
Yeah, but I think Roger Ronnie is 100% right there that we need, more people that are doing it on a regular basis to stand beside these people.
Yeah.
No, me and you have done it, but the ones who have stood beside, on different cities, haven't come out and kept.
Yeah, but as you say, we've gone to their areas, we've done it with them, but they haven't carried on. So you've got to work that bit out as well.
Thank you for watching this episode of Common Ground. As I mentioned at the beginning, this was quite a long recording session, and we set a new record, so it's being divided into 3 parts. So if you want to see those other parts, be sure to hit that subscribe button and follow us on social media. We also want to have the most diverse representation of the animal advocate community as possible, so please share our Facebook events, and you may want to consider using that Facebook Invite Friends feature so we can be sure this is getting to as many animal advocates as possible. Thanks for watching, be sure to share your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.